The Invisible Enemy is an absolutely ridiculous story that I had a really fun time with. There is a really good time to be had with this one, so long as you take it as seriously as it takes itself. In stark contrast to the previous serial, Horror of Fang Rock, this one has a significantly more lighthearted tone, generally favoring a somewhat carefree adventure with a frankly ridiculous style over legitimate drama with serious stakes. In fact, this story very much feels like basically nothing that we've gotten from the Fourth Doctor's era up to this point. It wouldn't fit at all in the Hinchcliffe era of the show, and thus it does mark a bit of a notable change in the show that wasn't as well highlighted in Horror of Fang Rock. I really had no idea what I was going to get when I went into this one, and I ultimately found myself pleasantly surprised by the crazy and honestly goofy directions this story took. We go to a number of different locations across the 4 parts of this serial, and the story has a good deal of momentum as it does that, with things constantly happening to keep you somewhat interested in what is going on. And for as much fun as I did have with this one, it does ultimately suffer just a little bit from pacing that lags, though the story constantly has things happening and manages to do this throughout. At a certain point, I did find myself being a little bit less engaged in its silly ongoings. I think it just ever so slightly outstays its welcome, and would have worked better at just 3 parts long. Stylistically, the 2 easiest story comparisons I can make to this one are Planet of Giants and The Time Monster. Those are both serials that are very goofy, and are also ones that I find to be a good deal of fun. All of these ones are quite ridiculous and have a number of different set pieces or locations, and are ultimately rather inconsequential adventures. I recall noting with Planet of Giants that it stayed just the right amount of time at 3 parts long, and that 4 parts probably would have resulted in an inferior story. In fact, I think that one was filmed to be 4 parts but was cut back. I could be wrong, so take that with a few grains of salt. In the case of The Time Monster, I actually think it had a little bit of an engaging plot to fall back upon, so if it didn't have a fun sequence happening on screen, it would have some kind of a plot moving. And I do feel that this one fell just a little bit into the trap that Planet of Giants avoided by gutting its 4th part, because by the time I got into the last 22-ish minutes of this thing, I was kind of over it. Don't get me wrong, I was still having a reasonable amount of fun, but I had basically had my fill of shenanigans at this point and was ready for the serial to end. And I think if this thing had stuck to 3 parts, it would have been that much stronger and that much more fun, because it is a story that as it sits with me, I enjoy it less the more I think about it, the more time I have with it, the less I find myself appreciating it. As I said, I had a fair amount of fun while I watched it, even if it outstayed its welcome a little bit, but it certainly isn't a story that gets better the more you think about it. In terms of the villain of the piece, we get that in the form of the titular Invisible Enemy, and it's basically this entity that can go inside a person's brain and take over their mind. Effectively, the more you try to use your brain, the easier it is for it to take over. And with this kind of a villain, you can either take the concept seriously and try to create a somewhat creepy tale about an enemy that can get inside your own head, and how damaging that can be to a person, or you can basically say, to hell with it, let's have a 90-minute campy space story where the concept of the actual villain doesn't matter much more other than how it leads to the next action sequence and what crazy antics it will lead our characters into. I will talk a bit more about what we got from the villain later, but overall, it worked well enough for the purposes of this story. And for the most part, this one really does prefer having fun as opposed to treating its concepts seriously. At times, it attempts a more drama-focused approach to these characters' minds being controlled, but those moments are few and far between, ultimately getting lost in the grand scope of this story. This isn't a bad thing, but just by the lack of substance of most of this story due to the way it is approached, it can't help but lack much in terms of a lasting impression. And don't get me wrong, I had a blast with this one, particularly in the first 3 parts of the story, but after I was done watching it, it didn't really leave me with much to think about, which is honestly a bit of a shame. And it does put me in an awkward position in terms of thinking about this story, because it's hard to know how much I factor the feelings I had during my viewing experience as well as the impression it left me with after the story had finished into some semblance of an opinion. You know, normally when you finish watching something, you know how you feel about it, at least to an extent, and that was also true for this one. But sometimes really pinpointing specifically where this episode would land in terms of a rating, for example, can be quite difficult. The supporting characters in this story do leave a lot to be desired, with the majority of them being given extremely little to do. However, there were two that I did enjoy, the first of which was Professor Marius. I genuinely enjoyed his character and found him to be a largely rather charismatic and enjoyable presence within this. Oddly, the actor who portrayed the character actually appeared exactly 2 seasons ago in season 13's Planet of Evil. The only reason this is odd is because, for whatever reason, I just didn't recognize him. There wasn't a lot to that character, but he worked well as a supporting cast member, brought to life well by the actor's performance. The other notable supporting character comes in the form of everybody's favorite tin dog, K9. Now that I think about it, K9 was probably my first companion because I think my first story was the Ribos operation, though it is admittedly hard to remember these things, and I just can't help but enjoy him as a supporting character. I find that he works very well when utilized a bit within the story, both in assisting the main characters and in providing some amount of comedy. He's just a nice, useful robot dog, and I really enjoy him. Being familiar with his voice, I will say that it doesn't quite sound the way that I'm used to it from season 16, but that's not a legitimate criticism of the character, just something that doesn't quite feel right just yet. At least with my biased perception of how the character should be. In terms of our main cast of characters, they were again solid. I do really enjoy the Doctor, and I'm becoming incredibly fond of Leela as a companion. The two work rather well together for the most part, and I enjoy their unique dynamic. Occasionally, the Doctor is a little too rude to Leela, which I'm not the happiest about. I mean, I get that he snaps sometimes, but also, calm down, dude. Sometimes it's played for comedy, and in those instances, it can actually work, but when the Doctor is just mean, I don't know, it's not something I enjoy seeing, and if it does come out, I personally feel there should be a justifiable reason for it, like the story they happen to be in being particularly dangerous, for example. But as said, they are quite good together. Leela has been doing a good job of coming into her own, and I have been enjoying her with the Doctor. And this is the point in the story where I will give you a genuine spoiler warning for what happens further into this one. So feel free to skip the time as shown on screen to avoid said spoilers. I doubt they'll ruin your experience, but I will always try to give you a spoiler warning before discussing developments that don't occur near the beginning of a story. Anyways, let's continue. I said I would talk a little bit more about the villain, and yeah, that's definitely worth doing. It works well enough, especially earlier in the story, but it also does leave a decent amount to be desired, with its execution feeling fitting within the style of the story, but also a bit of a disappointment in terms of any semblance of a memorable foe. It's fine, it is perfectly fine, but it's definitely not a reason I'll be coming back to revisit this one. I did kind of like the final form of this creature that we got in part 4, but in equal measure, I also kind of didn't like it whatsoever. As you can tell, it did leave me a little bit mixed on the whole. It's just this weird, grotesque looking thing, and it's also not particularly intimidating or fun, which does somewhat beg the question, what was it really trying to be, particularly in the concluding part of this serial? I don't know, on the whole it was fine, but nothing to really write home about. Hey, did I mention this episode is absolutely insane? I do enjoy when Doctor Who can do absolutely ridiculous things like this and have no care for making any kind of reasonable sense. I completely understand if people don't like this story, but at the same time, the Doctor and Leela make clones of themselves, shrink them down, and get inserted into the original Doctor's brain, where they get to wander around looking for the nucleus, and how could you not love this? I mean, it's just utterly ridiculous and good fun to watch. Okay, I can't actually make a reasoned defense of this story on any sort of a technical or story level, but I will absolutely defend the style it's going for and the way it goes about it. Because it's silly, it's entertaining, it's unabashedly ridiculous, and I just enjoy it for the fun that I have watching it. Also, this serial has quite possibly the worst final line of any episode ever.
You could do me a great favour if...
Take K9 with us?
Yes.
Oh. Yes! Oh, please, Doctor, please, let's take him.
K9 seems to have made up his own mind. I only hope he's TARDIS trained.
I can defend many things across this episode, but that horrendous final line is just not one of them. I don't know what they were thinking. Oh my god. Overall, I had a pretty good time with this story, which served as a more definitive transition into the new era of Doctor Who under producer Graham Williams. It was an utterly ridiculous and silly story that I couldn't help but have a good deal of fun with, even though it went on perhaps one part too long. Our main characters are really good, and I was happy to see the introduction of K9, who makes a welcome addition to the crew. I enjoyed this one for what it was, even though it doesn't leave you with a particularly significant impression once you're left to think about it. This was a pretty good story, and I'm going to give The Invisible Enemy a rating of 7.25 out of 10. And that does it for today, folks. Be sure to leave your thoughts on The Invisible Enemy down below. I am not anticipating the most kind of reactions to it, but I'd like to know what you have to say nonetheless if you care to share. And if you do join me again, possibly this coming Sunday or one of the following Sundays afterwards, I will be bringing you a review of The Image of Fendahl. I can't say with certainty when that review will be, but hopefully it won't be too long of a wait. So I do hope to see you around for that, but if not, that is completely fine, so long as you know that I appreciate your time here today. And with that said, thank you very much for watching, take care, and have a lovely week.